Hackintosh. For years, the only way to get macOS on powerful hardware without selling a kidney. If you're not familiar with them, when Apple transitioned to using Intel CPUs, there was immediate interest in whether this would make it possible to run macOS on a generic x86 PC. As it turns out, Intel Macs did indeed have a lot in common with them, and it didn't take long for the community to smooth over the remaining differences. While Apple did take measures towards preventing macOS from running on generic hardware, they weren't particularly tough measures, and for the most part they kept a pretty hands-off approach to the whole thing. And to be honest, it's not hard to see why. Hackintoshes were hardly the "it just works" experience that people usually want when they buy a Mac.
I'm not kidding.
macOS might run beautifully on the few bits of hardware Apple offers, but the moment you step outside that, it's essentially the Wild West. Hackintoshes are infamous for breaking over time, usually through software updates, but also sometimes seemingly at random, making them a generally unwise choice for any kind of daily driver that you need to do real work on. Apple recognized that as long as no one was selling and supporting easy, pre-built computers, and they do make sure no one does, a couple of nerds hacking together their own as a hobby hardly threatened their business. In fact, it could even promote it, as I know a lot of former Hackintosh users ended up liking it so much they eventually just bought a real Mac so they wouldn't have to deal with any more issues. However, with the right hardware, obviously the closer it is to a Mac the better, and with patience, care, and a little bit of luck, you can have an experience more or less identical to a real Mac for a fraction of the cost. Often this does require you to build the PC yourself with parts hand-picked that are known to work well with macOS. This also requires you to accept the fact that you probably built a pretty decent gaming PC as a result that can't play games because it's running macOS. But apart from that, it is very much doable. Except not for much longer. With Apple now transitioning away from Intel CPUs and towards their own, Hackintosh's days are very much numbered. Even if ARM processors gain more popularity in the PC world, since Apple designs their own chips in-house and they're already known to have extra undocumented instructions, it's basically guaranteed that macOS won't be compatible with just any ARM CPU. Now, this isn't necessarily a bad thing. Like I said, a lot of people Hackintosh just to get better performance for the money, and the Apple Silicon has been a lot better in that regard. So the move, I think, makes a lot of sense for them, and I'm sure killing Hackintosh is a nice cherry on the top. Now, I've been on and off Hackintoshes for about 15 years now. My first one was in 2007. It looked like this and ran good old macOS 10 Tiger and later Leopard. I still miss this era of the Mac, and yes, I listened to many emo songs in iTunes on it. It was 2007, what can I say? But while we still can, I've wanted to showcase some of the more interesting things that we can only do because the Mac used Intel processors. Last year I installed quite possibly the greatest version of Windows ever made on an iMac. This year I'm doing the opposite. Now that Microsoft makes their own hardware in the form of the Surface, I figured it was only fair. Some people do in fact call these the MacBooks of the PC world, both in a positive and negative sense. They're often not very repairable, the RAM is soldered to the board, but they have a great screen, great touchpad, and look sleek and stylish, if that's what you're into. Apple might have been perfectly fine helping Windows run on the Mac, but I don't think they'll be quite so happy with what I'm going to do today. That's right, we're installing macOS on a Microsoft laptop, just to make Steve Jobs roll in his grave once more.
Who the hell is Steve Jobs?
Here's our subject, the Surface Laptop 3. Currently, this has Windows 11 installed on it. But nobody wants that, let's get that off of there. Once again, Hackintoshing is a very your mileage will vary sort of thing. Even variations of the same computer can produce wildly different results. This very Surface laptop also comes in a Ryzen configuration that will absolutely not run Hackintosh. As such, you shouldn't follow this as a tutorial because chances are you'll need to do very different things on your end. To figure out what those things are, I recommend Dortania's Open Core Install Guide, which I'll link in the description. It's extremely long and detailed, and it has to be because it's trying to cover an effectively infinite amount of hardware configurations, but it's by far the most helpful resource I've found in my years of Hackintoshing. But even with that, this will be a long trial and error process. Expect to spend a while setting it up just for it to not work, just to go back and make some changes, just for it to throw some kind of cryptic error that no one else has ever seen before. Now, I'm using Big Sur for this, and you might be wondering why when, as of this video, it's already over 2 years old. Well, at the time I started this video, Monterey was, and I think to an extent still is, considered riskier since it introduced a lot of new issues, and the brand new Ventura was still very much in beta, so Big Sur seemed like the least problematic choice. Eventually, I had the installer booting. Everything was super small because this is a high DPI screen, but we can force a Retina resolution later on. Otherwise, it looks pretty good. Some pretty common trouble spots like full resolution and Wi-Fi were working first try, which was particularly cool in the case of the Wi-Fi. This computer has an Intel Wi-Fi chip, which for years has been a sore spot of Hackintosh because despite how common they are in PCs, no Mac has ever shipped with Intel Wi-Fi, so no driver has ever been approved by Apple. In true Apple fashion, they also never publicly documented the Wi-Fi driver APIs, making it extremely challenging for the community to port one from Linux or FreeBSD. But about 2 years ago, someone finally managed to get one working. Yes, it made its first stable release just after Apple announced they were killing Hackintosh altogether, but it still made a huge difference in the world of Hackintosh laptops. Now, the more observant among you may notice that the installer is in Russian. Russian happens to be what the config is set to by default, and the guide does explain clearly how to change it, but in my haste I just missed it, despite having done this several times before. But there were some much bigger issues that needed to be dealt with. Okay, so Trackpad doesn't work. Kind of expected that. No keyboard, kind of expected that. Yeah, I was so excited about the Wi-Fi working that I forgot to mention we can't even use this thing yet. Why did I kind of expect this? Well, with a desktop computer, everything is usually pretty standard. Your peripherals are probably all regular USB. If you have Intel Wi-Fi, it's probably not a big deal to replace it or at least add in an extra card. And if there's some custom component on the motherboard that doesn't quite work, it's probably not the end of the world. On laptops, it's a very different story. A lot more critical elements are often controlled by custom hardware, whether it's relatively non-critical things like detecting the lid closing or reporting how much battery life is left, to absolutely crucial infrastructure like what protocol it uses to connect the keyboard and mouse. This is where the long process of trial and error begins. Figuring out what hardware is in your computer, what community drivers you might need, or if they even exist in the first place is a, let's say, adventure. Sometimes macOS might actually support the hardware natively, but you need to spoof its ID or provide some other connective tissue to get it to pick it up. And for the most part, you don't know exactly what you're in for until you've already gotten started. If it sounds tedious, that's because it is, and if you want to get into Hackintoshing, it's something you'll need to get used to. I tried plugging in a USB keyboard and mouse just so I could try continuing the installer, but they didn't work either. After some tweaking, I managed to, surprisingly, get Bluetooth to pick up, but when I tried to pair it with a Microsoft ergonomic Bluetooth mouse, yep, we're going all Microsoft hardware today, it didn't seem to pick up. I should mention that it's common for laptops to connect their keyboard and trackpad through ye old PS2, which is significant because Apple never supported PS2. There is a Kext, and I did try it, but this laptop is using something else. Something called I2C, which I have no real familiarity with, but thankfully I didn't have to, because I soon discovered something very interesting. A community-made Kext called Big Surface. It's an all-in-one Kext designed to get several things working when using macOS on a Microsoft Surface. How convenient! The pun is explained in the README. Big Sur, the then most recent version of macOS, and Surface.
Oh, brother, this guy stinks!
Lol, indeed. P.S. If you have a better name, please let me know. Well, I don't see how that's possible. How can you improve on perfection? Lack of naming confidence aside, it actually helped a lot. Just adding that got the keyboard and mouse working, meaning we could finally proceed with the installation. As advertised, it also got the battery indicator working, which is always nice, and it probably fixed several other things that I didn't even notice were broken before. And so we were off and running. Installing macOS on a Microsoft laptop.
Dogs and cats living together, mass hysteria.
Enough, I get the point.
Squarespace is the all-in-one platform for creating a beautiful and professional-looking website with no hassle. If you're looking to start a business, blog, online store, or really any kind of web presence, Squarespace is the easiest way to do it. They have hundreds of responsive templates to suit any need you may have, and you get a fantastic WYSIWYG editor that lets you do anything, no code required. But if you do like to code, you can also enter custom CSS and header code anywhere you want. I especially like running my online store on Squarespace because it means that all that delicate payment information is being handled by widely used and well-tested code, rather than something cobbled together by me at 2 AM. So if you're looking for a convenient and straightforward way to make a website, look no further than squarespace.com. They have a free trial that lets you check out all of their features, and when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/MattKC to save 10% off your first purchase. As cool and rewarding as making progress here may be, if all of that trial and error sounded like an ungodly amount of work, Hackintoshing probably isn't for you. At the end of the day, I got off pretty easy finding a Kext made specifically for this computer. That's almost never the case, and this process could have easily been more challenging than it was. When you think about it, it actually kind of makes sense why Apple never severely cracked down on Hackintosh. If you're in their target demographic, i.e. creative professionals or people who want something that just works, the last thing you want to do is any of this. Despite how technically close their computers were to PCs, Apple maintained enough control over their ecosystem that even though anyone could build their own Mac, most average users still preferred to pay the premium. It could be said that macOS has the worst hardware compatibility of any desktop OS in the world, but it could also be said that that's kind of Apple's whole business strategy. Even this laptop is teetering on the edge of Hackintosh compatibility. It has a 10th generation Intel CPU, which coincidentally is the last Intel generation Apple has and probably will ever ship. If you have an 11th gen Intel CPU, it can work if you spoof the CPU IDs, but if you're stuck with the integrated graphics on that CPU, there is nothing that you can do. No one has ever written a driver for Intel 11th gen graphics, and without Apple's explicit permission, no one ever will. So if this laptop was literally any newer, this project wouldn't be possible at all. Hackintosh is already dying, even while Apple is still selling Intel-based products. Anyway, the installer managed to finish with no problems, but when I tried to boot into the OS, it kernel panics. Cool. Actually, I just missed another part of the tutorial. I had to set some kernel parameters to set some things related to Intel graphics. They're specific to this generation of Intel GPU, so I guess I accidentally glossed over them. But hey, now it's working. Sort of. Always sort of when it comes to setting up a Hackintosh. The mouse no longer seemed to be working, but then I realized it was, I just couldn't see it very well. It was glitched to hell, but as it turns out, this is a fairly common issue with Intel GPUs on Hackintosh. You have to patch the frame buffer using the whatevergreen patching guide. I'll be honest, I read through a sizable chunk of this and never figured out exactly what it was doing. But it did get the cursor to appear, so I call that a win. But I noticed pretty quickly some other graphical issues. Every now and then the whole screen would flicker or parts of it would glitch out. It's minor-ish, it's not like it prevents me from using it, but I definitely want to try to fix that. But let's handle some more important things first, like the tiny DPI. Actually, I guess the issue is there's too much DPI, but you know what I mean. Thankfully, there are plenty of tools out there designed just for this purpose. They create a fake profile for your display where you can specify whatever resolutions you want and use it to override the OS's built-in one. But now if I open System Preferences, I have a new set of resolutions ready to go, including this monitor's native resolution at 2x DPI, just like a Retina display. Look at that, that is absolutely beautiful. I actually really like the Surface's 3x2 aspect ratio screen. There's so much more room for productivity than a standard 16:9, and while MacBooks are a little bigger at 16:10, 3x2 just feels right to me. Then again, the MacBook screens are 10-bit, which is also nice. Anyways, one issue down, several more to go. Firstly, there's no sound, which is not uncommon in Hackintosh. Thankfully, Apple wasn't nearly as stingy about their audio driver documentation, so there are plenty of community drivers out there, it's just a matter of finding the right one. This laptop uses a very common Realtek ALC sound card, which has had a Kext for several years now. All we have to do is figure out what layout ID to use. There are a lot of them, but you can narrow them down if you know exactly what model you have. For this, I ended up booting into Linux, which told me it was an ALC 274. As you can see, that gives us a short list of IDs it could be, so off I went trying them all. Interestingly, the first two I tried, the microphone worked, but while it thought it had an output, nothing was actually coming out. However, the third one I tried, for reference ID number 35, worked like a charm. As soon as I heard the sound of an Apple device being charged on boot, I knew the sound was good to go. Next, there was an issue with the Trackpad. For the most part, it was working really well. macOS had picked it up with full gesture and multi-touch support, I'm guessing thanks to Big Surface again, and in many ways it felt like a genuine MacBook touchpad, at least before they moved to haptic clicking. But there was something kind of odd if I tried to do a hard click. Tapping was fine, but hard clicking seemed to right click? And it didn't matter where or how I did it, it always seemed to happen. But guess what? Turns out this isn't a right click at all. It's a force click. I barely remembered this was even a thing. For those who don't know, Apple briefly had a feature where if you pressed harder on a touchable surface, it would perform a different action. This first started on the Apple Watch, but soon permeated to the iPhones and MacBooks where no one really used them and they were eventually quietly discontinued. Turns out this trackpad was so convincing that macOS assumed it did support force touch. And when it got a binary on-off click signal, it assumed on meant pushed as hard as possible, so it did a force click. While there's probably an elegant way to tell macOS that this trackpad doesn't support Force Touch, I decided it'd be much simpler to just turn it off in the settings. After all, it's not like I'd be using Force Touch even if this trackpad did support it. That left us with two issues that I've mentioned already. The USB that I tried to get working in the installer still doesn't work, and the screen is still glitching out and flickering every now and then. USB is another common hackintosh issue. Since macOS doesn't have to deal with a wide variety of USB controllers, or many USB ports at all as a matter of fact, it turns out it's not very good at it. So when hackintoshing, it's generally recommended to test and declare every USB port on your computer by plugging a device into each one and seeing what number it comes up as. In fact, you kind of have to do it twice because macOS sees USB 2 and USB 3 ports as wholly separate, even if they're the same physical port. So you need to test the USB 2 and 3 device in each one. Ironically, the Surface Laptop 3, in a very MacBook fashion, only has a couple of USB ports, so it doesn't seem like a lot could go wrong. Regardless, I went ahead trying to detect and declare each port, only to find that neither port would show any devices whatsoever. The only things that did show up were the webcam and Bluetooth, which were obviously connected internally. This was very strange. I felt like I was following the instructions to the letter, so why wasn't it actually working? Well, it's because there were other instructions I had not followed to the letter. There's this part of the initial OpenCore setup guide that mentions setting a flag to true, which I did, but it also says don't set it to true if you're installing macOS 11.3 or higher. Apparently that version really broke something with the USB, but I'd managed to miss that note entirely. After turning that flag off, the USB finally worked just as expected. Yeah, that's another thing you need to contend with on Hackintosh. Due to the various complexities of its setup, there's a lot of room for human error, as we've seen throughout this video. Finally, we come to those graphical glitches. My god, was this a pain in the ass to solve. I couldn't find any information about this. No one seemed to know what might be causing these glitches. I sat there for hours trying a ton of different frame buffer IDs, different values for the stolen memory and all of that, but nothing seemed to work. Sometimes things would just break harder or the cursor would disappear again, but nothing got any closer to actually fixing anything. I noticed that it only occurred during times when the GPU was under more heavy usage. If it was sitting idle at the desktop, you'd never see it, but if I was scrolling quickly through a web page or minimizing something with that Genie effect, or worst case scrolling through Apple Maps, then it would happen pretty much without fail. Sadly, this information didn't really help me find a solution, but I did include it in a Reddit thread I posted on r/hackintosh, which promptly got no reply, but funnily enough, only 2 hours after posting it, I did end up finding the solution. The What Evergreen Patching Guide has a troubleshooting section where it lists a bunch of common issues and ways to solve them. I was reading through them in vain, trying to find anything that might help, when I started reading one that at first didn't seem relevant at all. It mentioned the display staying garbled for 7 to 15 seconds after boot and adds some delay to resolve it. Well, I wasn't seeing any of that, but I kept reading and it mentioned sort of offhand that a delay of 0 caused flickering in some laptops and that the default was later changed to 1 to fix that. So I thought, let's try turning that on. If a delay of 0 might cause flickering, then it being disabled entirely might cause that too? Well, holy shit. That actually fixed it. I later remembered the OS would sort of pause on a black screen for a few seconds before showing the login screen, but I never really thought much of it. That might actually be the 7 to 15 second garbled display that the guide was talking about. Indeed, it is gone now, so that must be it. And now, after using it for some time, I can safely say this laptop finally works perfectly. Sort of. Always sort of. While for the most part it really is working great now, there are a few things that still don't work that I'm probably not going to fix. While the touchscreen is kind of the Surface's trademark, I've never been super interested in using a touchscreen on a laptop. Apparently Big Surface does fix this, you just have to install an SSDT patch. I'm just not going to. I'm also not super interested in the ambient light sensors that automatically control the backlight. Big Surface does claim to fix that, but it still seems to be broken on my end, and honestly I prefer manually setting it anyway, so I'm not really bothered. The worst remaining issue I do have is that it doesn't seem to be able to wake from sleep. Big Surface says it's a known issue that neither the keyboard nor mouse can wake the system, but I found that even external peripherals or trying to use the power button didn't work either. This can be yet another sore spot for Hackintosh. In fact, it's a sore spot for this laptop in general. Some people working on getting Linux on the Microsoft Surface have said that Microsoft actually messed something up in the hardware of the Surface Laptop 3 and then had to patch it manually in Windows. I can't say if that's exactly what's happening here, but whatever it is, I probably don't have the time or expertise to really figure it out, so I just disabled sleep entirely. Not ideal, but better than having to hard reset anytime the lid is closed or it's left idle for a few minutes. So yeah, that's macOS on a Microsoft laptop. Surprisingly functional. I don't want to say it's just like a MacBook. I mean, you've already seen how much effort goes into just setting one up, and that doesn't count whatever maintenance might be necessary long term. As I've said, there are a lot of ways things can go wrong, so you may not want to trust it as a daily driver for any critical work. It's like having a hobby project car. It can be a lot of fun solving all the problems and really exciting getting something to work, but it's not usually a reliable thing to get you to work every morning. While people can and do rely on Hackintoshes for real day-to-day productivity tasks, it's likely that this is through a combination of highly compatible hardware, good maintenance practices, and luck. In fact, while I was working on this video, a Microsoft Surface firmware update that was automatically installed by Windows on a separate partition broke the keyboard and mouse again, requiring a new version of Big Surface to fix it. So as careful as you might be, there are always things like that that could come up out of nowhere. Plus, a lot of people like MacBooks for the status symbol. Are people going to see you as part of the club just because you're running macOS? Probably not. They just want to see that Apple logo on the lid. It could be running Windows for all they care. In fact, they'll probably think you're poorer because you had to fake a MacBook. We also can't forget that Apple has pulled the plug on Hackintosh. It took Apple 4 years from announcing the Intel switch to releasing the first version of macOS that didn't support PowerPC, and we're already 2 years from the announcement that they were switching to ARM. Basically, if you set one of these up now, you probably only have a few more years to get the most out of it. But putting all of that aside, I'd honestly argue this is the closest thing to a non-MacBook MacBook that you can get. There are probably easier Hackintosh hardware configurations out there, but as far as the overall look and feel goes, I think it's super close and in some ways, honestly, better. So yeah, if you're interested in doing this and you keep all of that in mind, I think you actually end up with a pretty decent computer at the end, or at least an interesting hobby project. Anyways, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you all in the next one. Bye guys.
Subscribe to MattKC.